meeting. So.
Okay, so here's what we're going to do. I've gathered up your questions. Many of them are very good. I've organized them topically, and I've given them to Dr. Post, and I'll answer the questions. You can take notes. Some of you will recognize your questions. Some of them maybe not. I've edited them slightly, and we'll go from there. And if you want to ask follow-ups, you're free to do that as well. So you'll give an answer. If you want to follow up, that's fine. We'll go for 50 minutes. So our first question focuses on the central topic of religion and happiness. And there were several questions on this particular theme. And so here's one version of it. You see, Dr. Post, you seem to have mixed messages regarding the relationship between religion and happiness. On the one hand, you said that you're not convinced that religious people are happier in general than atheists. But on the other, that when people participate in the right religious communities, they will be more likely to be more giving and in turn happier. Then again, on the one hand, you say that religion is not necessarily always a contributing factor to happiness. But on the other, that theology matters to you, and that religious communities are the most successful means to someone finding their happiness. Can you clarify these apparently conflicting claims?
Sure. Those are good questions. So I'm ambivalent about religion. I'm not quite sure what religion is. I know there are many world religions, and each one is distinctive. Some are categorized as Abrahamic, Islam, Judaism, Christianity. But religions actually vary tremendously. In making any kind of generalization, I always feel like I'm on fairly thin ice. I do believe that any thinking person who looks at the world around us is probably going to say that particular religions can bring out the very best in people sometimes, which they do, but they also bring out the very worst in people. They bring out arrogance, they galvanize very much tribalistic sentiments. They can contribute to the dehumanizing of outsiders, of non-believers, and even the demonization of outsiders. And so religion, if you want to use that broad term, at its best, is, I think, consistent with happiness. I don't mean superficial happiness, but I mean a certain kind of interior peace, if you will. But again, I'm very careful not to make generalizations. Obviously, religions of a sort can bring tremendous misery into the world, don't you think? There are people who've had miserable experiences with their particular tradition. I can recall, just to give you a kind of worst case scenario, was it 10 or 12 years ago, out in San Diego, when a number of adolescents and young adults were following a fellow named Whitehurst, I believe, and he believed that they could catch a ride on the Hale-Bopp comet. Don't ask me to explain how, but the men in the group packed suitcases, castrated themselves, took poison, and went to bed. Now, you can say to yourselves, well, maybe they were happy in doing that as true believers, but objectively speaking, that's a little hard to take. But I don't dismiss the idea. So I think, but in general, religion is not always something that brings happiness into people's lives, and so it depends on the structures. It depends on polity. It depends on whether people are relatively flourishing in their spiritual lives, or whether they feel oppressed and overwhelmed by authoritarian figures of various kinds. So it's such a mixed bag, and that's why I'm ambivalent. But I would say that religion at its best is strongly associated with feelings of intrinsic meaning, which come from a sense of a place in the universe. Some of my favorite interpretations of religion have to do with attachment theory, that from the time we're born we're dealing with separation and attachment, separation anxieties. We're thrown into the world, it's a cold, anxious place, and we look to reattach to secure bases, as the psychologists put it. And to some degree, I think, especially when people are coping with the real hardships of life, they find the idea of attachment to a universally loving presence that is somehow in control, and they don't feel that they're in control themselves. I think that can give a sense of inner tranquility and a sense of calmness. Augustine would say we find our rest in God. Pascal would say that we have a God-shaped hole in us that leaves us feeling incomplete, and nothing can really fill it other than this somehow more transcendent source of meaning and love. So I think that again, at its best and undistorted, is for many people a source of happiness. In clinical situations when individuals have severe diagnoses and they're really going through hardships, it's astonishing to me to see how many of them say that their major way of coping is through spirituality, however defined. Again, some kind of attachment with a source of love and meaning that is in control of the universe when they obviously feel that they're not. And I think that the happier traditions are going to engage individuals in sincere love of neighbor, both in the community but also outside of the community, and that includes people who don't necessarily believe as you do. So there is a kind of ontological generality, I guess I would say, in the love of God, however defined, and the love of neighbor as self. I think that for many people is a source of happiness that is really quite profound and deeper than some of the other alternative sources of happiness in our culture, including materialism and the like. Kierkegaard wrote a wonderful book called Works of Love, and he said, I have nothing against the love of self, but it's just that we need to love ourselves rightly in order to be happy. And for him, the idea of loving yourself rightly had something to do with being in tune with the universe, with a higher power, and especially, though, with caring for the neighbor. And so in that context, we would find a higher kind of flourishing ourselves. But religions are all over the map. Some of them, at their best, really contribute to happiness, and then others, at their worst, certainly, contribute to a great deal of misery. So it's too easy to make generalizations for me about these things. Does that make any sense to anybody? And I guess if you had a show of hands and you asked people, well, does religion make you happy? And there have been some studies on this. It is true that people, there are 40 or 41% of Americans who report that they're regular worshipers. They go to church or synagogue regularly. That may be a little bit high, it could be more like 35%, depending on whether it's self-report, which is the little higher figure, or more observed reporting. And it is said that that those who are regular worshipers do feel slightly happier. But that doesn't solve any problem for me, because I have no idea what it is in their religious lives that is contributing to this happiness. It could be that they're helping others and they find great joy in that. It could be that they find inspiration and sources of hope despite their circumstances. It could be that in the world around them, they live in social hierarchies, and they're at the bottom of some totem pole, if you will, and we know that creates a lot of stress and unhappiness and even ill health. And so when they're in this community, somehow they feel the world's been turned topsy-turvy, and now it's equal regard, and they're no longer lower class. And that would hold especially for certain communities in the inner city, for example, the African American traditions, where poverty is fairly endemic. So even if you say that on the basis of some large data sample, that people who are quote unquote religious in the sense of being regular worshipers, that they're a little bit happier than the general public, it still doesn't tell you what it is that's making that happen. So it's very complex, and that's why your questions are really appropriate, and it's why I am somewhat unclear and a little bit paradoxical about these things.
So would you kind of say that religion may be a stepping stone to happiness, as in like whenever I was in high school and now I join clubs that are specifically there to go and help other people, and I get great joy from that, but it has nothing to do with religion.
Yeah, so I think someone actually mentioned the Scouts in one of the questions. And the Scouts are an interesting organization because they do, from a young age, encourage pro-social, generative giving behaviors in an extremely creative fashion. Girl Scouts and Boy Scouts as well. And for the first time that I'm aware of, there's a person now at Baylor University named Byron Johnson in something called the Institute for the Study of Religion, the ISR, who actually has a big grant, and he's studying happiness in the Scouts and looking at it prospectively over long periods of time. I would suspect, if this is like service-based learning in the high schools, that the people who are genuinely involved, sincerely involved in this kind of generosity, that over the long haul, they are happier, more socially engaged, and probably less subject to depression. They probably have a little more resilience in the face of hardship, right? So I absolutely do agree that something like Scouts could be very positive in terms of a person's sense of well-being and happiness. Now, does it necessarily require a theological context, like you find in a church, for example, to get that benefit? No, it doesn't. In AA, Alcoholics Anonymous, everybody in their recovery process is helping other alcoholics. They're a greeter at the door, they're making the coffee, they're putting out the chairs, they're handing out literature, they're giving their testimonies, and so that's the 12th step of helping other alcoholics within these communities. But it's also spiritually oriented. So when you go to an AA meeting, the first thing that people do is repeat the Serenity Prayer. Do you know what that is? Does anyone know the Serenity Prayer? To distinguish the things you can change from things you can't change and whatever. And in some AA meetings, it's actually, there's a deeper sort of generic prayerful activity that goes on. So in the big book, which is the AA manual that was written by the founder of AA, Bill W. or Bill Wilson, it basically says, we alcoholics recover on the two axes of spirituality and altruism. Okay? And so it's structured that way. There's also a lot of emphasis in the 12 steps on personal repentance and possibly making amends to people you harmed in your alcoholic ways, although that's not always an easy thing to do or a necessary thing to do. But it's the combination of the spirituality and the helping others, those two axes that at least AA feels is crucial to recovery. Whether that's archaic and kind of quaint or really a prototypical kind of thing that we should think about more in terms of the future for certain clinical populations, I don't know. But you're absolutely right. I mean, it would be really interesting to ask yourself, can the benefits found in a religious community with regard to happiness be solely attributed, right, causally to the prosocial behavior? And that's the same kind of behavior that you could get in Scouts or in a variety of other secular organizations. I don't really have a knockdown, drag-out answer to that. There are people who study religion and social science, and they would contend that that the self-reported interaction with a higher secure base, if you will, using detachment theory, that itself contributes to at least reduced anxiety, better coping, and in a broad sense, some enhanced happiness. But I think that's difficult, so I'm not going to give a flippant response. I do think that an awful lot of the happiness that may occur in people who are regular members of religious communities is because those communities are teaching the love of neighbor. You're hearing someone give talk about the Good Samaritan. Maybe you're organizing a small group of your peers to go build a house over the summer for Habitat. Who knows what it might be? Maybe you're organizing yourselves to go to a nursing home and interact with the deeply forgetful. So all of that, to me, is part of the dynamic. But I can't really, it's very, no one's ever been able to really convince me what it is in a religious community, and they all differ, that really is contributing to happiness.
Dr. Post, in your talk last night, you said that people were happier in 1936 in the depths of the Depression than they are, say, in 2005. Why do you think that people were happier in 1936, even though we've had an increase in material wealth? Do you think this was because people of the past gave more?
Well, I think maybe, but it's really hard to say. So this is just self-reported happiness. I mean, we're not talking deep conceptual happiness necessarily here. We're just asking people, we're not talking about eudaimonism or, sort of momentary hedonic satisfaction. I mean, this is just, these studies are just asking people, show of hands, are you happy, right? And it does turn out that in 1936, when researchers first started doing this, there's a very good scholar named David Myers who's well known for this. People were a little happier, not a whole lot happier, but a little happier in 1936 than they were in, say, 2007. I do think that there was more community. I think that there has been a loss of social capital. There are major sociologists, you might not have heard of them, but one of them is named Robert Putnam, who's a sociologist at Harvard. He wrote a book called Bowling Alone, which is kind of his assessment of modern American culture. And he thinks that people are, in fact, more isolated. They're not so much participating in voluntary associations like they used to. There's been a kind of decline in the idea of the neighborhood, the assumption that you know the people in your neighborhood and you can interact with them and come to their aid and assume that they'll come to your aid. He says that 20 years ago, most Americans could report 5 really meaningful, deep friendships of people you could sit down with, not folks that you just party with, in the kind of very superficial sense of friendship. And Aristotle has to kinds of friendships, by the way, but something that's very deep and benevolent. He would call it a benevolent form of friendship, where you really have the kind of meaningful conversation, where you have friends who keep you on the right pathway, consistent with your values, so that you're not just wavering and doing things that are contrary to your own moral integrity. So a very deep kind of friendship. Putnam's point is that 20 years ago, most people had 5 really deep friends. Now it's down to about 2, he says, and he does national surveys on this topic. So that's what he means by loss of social capital. And I also think, it may be just the architecture of the world we live in. Where I live, there are no sidewalks. Sidewalks are kind of nice. When I grew up, we knew our neighbors. They'd be walking, in front of the house, and we'd say hi, and we had a big porch, and we sometimes would have iced tea or lemonade, and we'd call people up, and there was this kind of geography or architecture of pro-sociality and interaction and so forth. And I think some of that has been lost. A lot of these communities are designed now so that basically you drive into your garage and shut the door, and you don't see anybody around you, and then you go to work in the morning. So I can't really, be very clear about, 1936 vis-a-vis 2008, but I would suggest that people had more tight-knit communities, and probably clearer expectations in terms of being a good neighbor. Again, that's a really gross statement as a generalization, and I have to be very careful to try to defend it, in an appropriate way. But we have lost a certain amount of social glue, and I think maybe that's part of the problem. Certainly, the materialism is not the kind of source of happiness that some people think it is. Take a look at, there's interesting studies on people who win the lottery. You've heard about these, and they win the lottery and they're kind of euphoric for a while, but then pretty quickly they get back to their usual state of relative happiness or unhappiness. There are a lot of people who have terrible accidents and they go through a real valley of unhappiness, but then they oftentimes kind of rise up to their former state. So I think some happiness is a bit of a set point dispositionally, and it has something to do with genetics, but happiness researchers also point out that your environment makes a difference, how you're raised, what your social structure is, and also there's a certain kind of personal responsibility for happiness. In that sense, I'm a real existentialist about it. I think that Abraham Lincoln wasn't too far off. This is a guy who suffered from depression all of his life, who, if you read Lincoln's Melancholy that came out some years ago, his friends put him under what was in effect a 3-week suicide watch when his girlfriend in his early 20s died of an infection. He struggled with depression and melancholy all of his life, even to the very end. And he said, quote, "A man is about as happy as he makes up his mind to be." And he also engaged very purposefully in humor, partly with the people around him, but partly for himself. And he also involved himself in small helping activities. So there are nice stories about Abraham Lincoln going out of the White House, for example, unescorted with his top hat on, obviously was already 6'4", 6'5", going to Union Station and just helping a gal with her trunk and putting it on the train. And so another Lincoln quote is, "When I do good, I feel good. When I do bad, I feel bad. That is my religion." And by the way, some people overstate the religiosity, if you will, of Abraham Lincoln, and that's a big historical debate, but I don't think he was particularly religious, although he did attend church in certain communities. But anyway, so I can't really tell you, why 1936, how things have changed. The materialism gets you happier if you're coming out of poverty and you're being relieved of the anxiety of not being able to pay the rent or put food on the table. I know a lot of students feel that way, but you get to a certain point, and people talk about the hedonic treadmill, that you're just, gathering more and more accumulation, and you're comparing yourself, by the way, with peers who are equally well accumulated, if you will, and you do not get a happiness bump through that process. There are studies of students your age in Boston and Vancouver, and you give them $20 at the beginning of the day, they take a happiness scale. Half of them go out and they are told, give your $20 to someone else in need, and then half of them are told, well, use the $20 on yourself. And at the end of the day, when they come back, the ones who use the $20 for others tend to report a significant increase in happiness. That may not be lasting, but at least it's an interesting intervention. These are just incredibly difficult questions to answer, and I don't want to try to overstate my confidence.
Well, one thing you mentioned last night was that in 1936, life was simpler than they are now, and that this might have something to do with why they were happier. Can you comment on that, maybe?
Yeah, so there are people like Doc Kitchener at Berkeley, a sociologist, a very famous sociologist, who edits a magazine called Greater Good, something you may be familiar with. He's really good, a great researcher. And he studies the emotion of awe, and he believes that happiness is partly related to just the ability to feel awe and a sense of gratitude for the simple things in life. An attitude of gratitude is related to happiness, he believes. And so I'm actually a pretty simple guy. I don't have a lot of clothes, I don't have a lot of shoes, I don't have a lot of cars. I really like to live simply. Not that my kids necessarily agree with that, but that's how I am. And I have this sense of awe for the simple gifts of life, for nature around me. When we're driving down the highway, I'm always looking at the mountains in the distance and going, ooh, and wow, and I see a horse in a field. Look at that horse. I mean, there's this sense of joy that I personally can self-report that just comes from the wonder of it all, right? And I'm not sure, I have a 17-year-old son, I'm not sure he quite has that feeling. Well, I mean, he's oftentimes, he's a good kid, he's locked into texting, so he doesn't really look out the window so much when we're driving down the road. But I do think that if you have an appreciation for the simple gifts of life, including nature and nature's beauty and just the very enchantment of the universe around us, I think that is very much, for a lot of people, a source of happiness. And the nice thing is that it keeps you from having to be a radical consumer. Look at the consumerist culture, where people just think they have to have more and more. They have to have this new item and that new item and then the next new item, and keep up with all the fads and the phrases. And in the end, does that make people happier? Well, okay, so there is a book. There's actually a book about this, and it's called Predictably Irrational. It was a bestseller 2 years ago, and it's by a guy from Duke University, a psychologist. I can't remember his name. But what he says is that if you want material goods to make you happier, okay, and someone gives you a big wad of money, someone gives you $100,000, just buy whatever you want and make yourself happy. He says, don't go out and spend it all on one object, and don't spend it quickly. He said, get one thing at a time. Get a new sofa today, and you'll enjoy that for a few weeks or maybe a couple of months. But then that kind of joy will fade, and then you should get yourself a new set of tableware or whatever, that you should sort of spread it out and keep it going, because whatever kind of mood elevation you get from a material possession is going to fade once you become more or less acculturated and used to having that possession. Okay? But the hedonic treadmill, this is what you can Google easily, and it's been studied by a lot of people. It is really interesting that you're getting more and more and more and more, but it does not actually give rise to sustainable greater happiness. It gives rise to moments of euphoria. Wow, look what I have, but that fades. The deeper, more lasting happiness, Keltner argues, comes when we can just take incredible joy in the world around us, in the beauty of other people, in the beauty of great art and music, those kinds of things.
Dr. Post, let me ask you about happiness in kinds of helping. So the cases you considered most were cases of helping other people, but what about cases such as working at an animal shelter or planting trees in a restoration project? Do those kinds of things make people happy?
Oh, absolutely. So just 2 weeks ago, I was giving a talk in Secaucus, New Jersey, which is just outside of the Lincoln Tunnel in Manhattan, to a group of individuals who adopt dogs and cats who are in need of a home. And I have to tell you that their joy was palpable. And the gal who organized this program 4 or 5 years ago had a long conversation with me over lunch before my talk. And it turns out she was very, very close to her grandmother, and her grandmother had died, and this left this gal with a feeling of deep grief, and she became somewhat clinically depressed. And then she said she started this organization not just because she loved cats and dogs, as she does, but also because she felt that it would be really good for her. That wasn't her primary motive, and you got into these questions of motivation, which are really important. But it was certainly a secondary motive, and it may have even been an equal motive, because she said she'd been looking at some of the literature on happiness and giving. So it's hard to say. But I got to tell you, that group, and there were about 80 or 90 people in the room, they were just, they were flourishing in their activities, and they had incredible stories that they were sharing with one another about taking in this dog who had had this terrible experience, or this cat, and some of these animals, by the way, it turns out, I was amazed, had histories of illness. Some of them were diabetic and the like, and were really being cared for in a very intensive way. So certainly, the key thing, if you look at the studies on volunteerism and helping others, do something that you feel called for passionately. And it doesn't need to be with other human beings. It could be with non-human animals. It could be with the love of nature. But do something that you feel called to in a passionate way. And also do something that allows you to use your strengths, your natural gifts and talents, so that you have a feeling that you're actually making a difference. And then if you're able to, form a little social network around this activity, and so that you can share your experiences, and that's socially reinforcing. If you look at the literature on older adults and their volunteering, they are happier if they're pro-socially engaged. They're actually happier, less depressed, and on average they're living a bit longer from, say, age 60 upwards. But they drop out of these activities if they're doing something that they really don't feel passionate about, okay? Or if they're doing something, an activity that they don't feel they're competent in, and that makes them have a sense that they're spinning their wheels and not really, having an impact. So, sort of what you do is up to you, but the point of, getting beyond self and the problems of the self and contributing meaningfully to some sort of constituency in the world around you, whatever that might be, is generally a good thing.
Well, here's a variant on that sort of question. What about, are religiously motivated individuals who protest outside of abortion clinics happier? They likely believe they are helping the unborn and perhaps even the mothers. Does this helping of others make them happy?
So now that's I don't know who asked that, that's a great question. So, you know, giving takes different forms. Now, you know, over the years, I've done a fair amount of work with the Alzheimer's community. And I've done respite care with families who just need to get a break, go to a movie or go shopping for an afternoon, and then they can come back and be less subject to depression and burnout as caregivers. There are many, many different forms of helping and giving. Now, what you're talking about here with these are basically pro-life activists, I think you call them, okay? Activism is definitely a form of giving, but it's very distinctive in so many ways. The social activists, I know Martin Luther King was a social activist, I would say. And it's not like he was getting praise heaped on him day in and day out. Mother Teresa was, because she was not a social activist. In fact, Mother Teresa of Calcutta was very explicit that she wasn't interested in changing social structures or changing policies. She wanted to create a community, which she did very effectively, of like-minded individuals who would take care of the sick and poor on the streets of Calcutta. So she was world-renowned, and everyone's saying, hallelujah. And she won the first Templeton Prize 40 years ago for progress in religion, actually, you know. There was no controversy around her, although she had her dark nights of the soul, which came out posthumously. But someone who's an activist it's a different dynamic. They're trying to help the world, but not necessarily face to face, you know, in terms of, you know, working at the soup kitchen, you know, and having that sense of direct meaning and gratification in a dyadic or a larger social context. No, I mean, they're up against the wall. You know, they're confronting social and political obstacles. They may be an activist for gay marriage. They may be an activist for the environment. And I think that you know, when you ask, are those kinds of people happier? It's a little more complicated. I think they go through more difficulty. You know, Martin Luther King is described by the people who knew him as generally being quite happy and mirthful. And he wrote a wonderful collection of sermons called The Strength to Love, where he talked about you know, hope and love and mirth all sort of coming together, and how you, even though life is so challenging, obviously for him in the civil rights movement, you know, you're meeting people with baseball bats who are hitting you over the head. I mean, you know, throwing you in the Birmingham jail. But still, people say there was a kind of a mirth and a joyfulness in Martin Luther King, and when people who knew him were around him, even in the hardest times, they felt that, right? But still, what happened to Martin Luther King? He was assassinated, right? And this is an important point too. You know, anybody who's helping others with the idea of self-immolation, of self-destruction, is probably pathological. They're probably acting out of some psychic conflict. Maybe they're just you know, there's something unresolved in them, and they're essentially you could almost say altruistic masochists, and that does occur. In fact, some philosophers, like Nietzsche, have been very critical of do-gooders, if you will, because they sense that, at least some of them anyway, are motivated not so much by doing good to others as doing harm to themselves. So I'm very careful about that, because I'm interested in the psychiatry of pathological altruism. I do think it exists. But the activist, the social activist, has a hard road to hoe. Now, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, you may have heard of. Has anyone heard of Bonhoeffer? He was a German Lutheran pastor who Germany organized the attempt to assassinate Adolf Hitler. What's the movie with Tom Cruise? What? Yeah, the Valkyrie movie. So that's actually about the organization that was in fact headed by Dietrich Bonhoeffer. They let Bonhoeffer out of the movie, sadly enough. But Bonhoeffer was really the spiritual leader. He was a non-violent Christian. He believed in non-violence entirely. He was like almost a Mennonite in that sense. But he came to a very startling conclusion. Please don't take this very far, but he said the only loving thing you can do for Adolf Hitler is try to kill him, because he's that bad. And so reluctantly, Bonhoeffer moved forward in that direction. Well, of course, the attempt failed, and he was imprisoned from 1943. He came from a very distinguished family and had a lot of social clout. So Hitler was a little reluctant to hang him. But before Hitler died, about 2 weeks before he died, he ordered the hanging of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Now, Bonhoeffer was described by everybody who knew him as joyful, as mirthful, as really quite astonishingly effervescent, even in jail. So when he was taken by the hangman for execution, the hangman wept because he had gotten to know Bonhoeffer, and he just felt there was so much energy and so much joy in this man's heart. And so Bonhoeffer was hung. Now, it's not that he was looking for the noose, not that the king was looking for a bullet. They were being helpers in very difficult circumstances that involved them in efforts to unravel terribly unjust or destructive social structures. And so they weren't looking for their destruction. They weren't looking for, since they were both Christians, you would say the cross. But it found them, and they accepted it with courage, right? So it was not self-immolation that they were seeking. It was something that came their way. It kind of came with the territory. But I think when you ask the question of whether a pro-life activist is happy being an activist, I think that's a very tough question. There are studies in showing that when people live up to their values, that they do tend, on the whole, to be happier. And so maybe it's just the fact that somebody's out there in public protesting that gives them a sense of consistency, of integration, of integrity between their acts and their beliefs. And that, if you read the works of Salvador Madi, a developmental psychologist at Old University of Chicago, that, for some people, is a source of happiness. So maybe they feel that kind of happiness. It's not a hedonic happiness. It's more a eudaimonistic happiness. It's more the kind of happiness that you feel if if it was your last moment in life, and you could look back over your journey, and you can say, I did the things that were meaningful.
Okay, maybe one last question. Altruism was stressed throughout the talk. The idea is that we should genuinely want to help others when we help others, but also that we should help others because it makes us happier. But if we're doing this to make ourselves happier, this is no longer altruistic, right?
Okay. Well, guess what? So I do think, altruism has been mischaracterized. I knew a guy in Cleveland he'd been the editor of the New England Journal of Medicine. He retired, and I actually talk about him in a book. And he spent all of his time just voluntarily helping younger scholars edit their manuscripts so they could get them in really good medical journals like the New England Journal. And he had so much joy in doing this. It was absolutely astonishing. He was a better man than I. I mean, I get very tired and burned out when it comes to looking at other people's written materials. But he loved it. And so I was sitting at a lunch with him, and I said, you're really an altruist, aren't you, at heart? And he said, oh, no. You can't call me an altruist because I enjoy what I'm doing. Right? And some people have that. I think that altruism in the human species as I know it under most circumstances, actually very strongly associated with feelings of gratification, meaning, and happiness, okay? And I think if you wanted to define altruism so narrowly that those elements can't be part of the equation, even as an unintended side effect, then we're not talking about being human. And there I would refer to the descent of man and to group selection theory, and I try to say that there's something in our wiring that gives us these kinds of deeper emotional reinforcements when we're involved in this kind of behavior. I don't think something can be altruistic, okay, if it's motivated by tit-for-tat thinking. So I'm only helping you because I know that tomorrow you're going to help me. That kind of reciprocal, of course, I mean, I realize this is complex. A lot of people do talk about reciprocal altruism, and they use altruism in that sense. I tend not to. I think that altruism, to be altruism, should be free of the law of reciprocity. So it should not pay it back, but pay it forward. Have you heard that language in the culture? Just, be generous, be kind, be helpful to people around you, and don't calculate. Don't limit yourself on this. I tell you, I didn't mention this to you, but I gave a talk to a group of widows and widowers on Long Island. Did I mention this last night? I don't think so. And there'd been a study showing that widows and widowers who go through a lot of bereavement do better with their grief and come out of it more quickly if they can report some robust helping activity in their lives with various constituencies. And in the back of the room, there was this guy, and he looked at me and he said, "I don't care what you say, I don't do nothing for nothing." This is really Long Island, right? And I knew I wasn't in Cleveland anymore, by the way. So I think that's very limiting, and I think if that altruism is more a pay it forward rather than a pay it back kind of thing. And also in terms of reputational gain, what some people call indirect benefits or indirect reciprocity. So maybe I don't get something back tomorrow, but 5 years from now, people are going to remember my good deeds, and if I am in need, they'll come and help me. Again, I think that those kinds of motivations, if they're explicit, and motivation gets very complex in and of itself, I think maybe that's not altruism. But if helping others creates a sense of gratification, meaning, an inner calmness, a deeper sense of purpose, gives you, even in unanticipated ways, deeper networks and deeper relationships, deeper friendships, where you're interacting with other people who are finding the same kinds of meaning that you are, and so your friends are not just the kids you party with, but they're the kids who you share deeply with. I think if you have these kinds of, if it's affecting your brain and your hormones in some sort of constructive way as you're associated with the caregiving system, and therefore it's limiting stress and cortisol levels that are associated with negative adversarial emotions. I think that's just part of being human. I don't think you could ever say that those kinds of, what I'll say, are internal benefits in a sense, that they could ever be ruled out in the human species. And that if you think that altruism, to be altruism, has to rule those things out, then there is no altruism. Is that fair enough?
Yep. Are there follow-up questions? Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Wait a second.
Yeah.
Rachel.
I was going to say, you said that you couldn't really define the general characteristic among all religions that make people happier, and I was wondering if maybe you would attribute it to the fact that, you say when people are in bad times, they find religion, and it gives them a sense of serenity. Perhaps it's that they feel that everything that goes on is in someone else's hands, and it kind of takes their responsibility out of the situation.
Well,
Do you think that could be it?
yeah, so I think that that's true, but that's sort of my attachment theory of religion. I mean, if I were to give you my preferred social scientific theory, that would probably be it. you know, people are always trying to, you know, life is tough. I mean, the first words of Scotty Peck's The Road Less Traveled are, life is difficult, you know, and there are all kinds of stresses, and we discovered so many things that we thought we could control that we really can't control. And so people are constantly looking for reattachment opportunities. And especially when your life is in danger, for example, and you've got a sudden diagnosis of pancreatic cancer or whatever it might be. It's astonishing. University of Michigan women with gynecological cancer, 93% of them say that they cope primarily through their forms of spirituality. And so I do think that when Kierkegaard put it this way, I'm very much a Kierkegaardian. Kierkegaard said, we live in a false consciousness. He said, you get up in the morning, I don't know what you do when you get up in the morning, you take a shower, you brush your teeth, you put on your clothes, you get to the cafeteria, chomp down some cereal, and then you're off to your 8 o'clock class. And so life is very routinized, and it's full of patterns, and you get into patterns, and you just kind of move through the motions, you know? You're like a perpetual motion machine. But then he said, you know, something breaks into life. It could be a tsunami wave, it could be a tornado in Indiana recently, you know? Everything's gone, and you realize that your routines really were inauthentic, that you were clinging to them because they gave you a sense of security. But finally, it was a false sense of security, because in the final analysis, as the Buddhists would say, and Dalai Lama would agree with this, as with Kierkegaard, he would say all of that is illusory, because it all evaporates, right? And so in the end, where do you find that security, Kierkegaard said? Well, in his view, in these kinds of limited circumstances, that's an idea that Karl Jaspers would ultimately develop, you know, you have to look to something in the universe, or he said it is a human propensity, it may not be universal, but it's a human propensity to look to something in the universe that really is in control when you finally recognize that, no, I have much less control than I thought I had. Right? And so I do think that dramatic limit situations in illness or in life generally, severe disappointments and so forth, those are typically moments when people, at least in various religious modalities, I think when they begin to draw more on spirituality and religion. So right now, I have a daughter who's 28. You know, she's not particularly religious, although we raised her in a little Episcopalian church in Cleveland. But I wouldn't be surprised if at some point in her life, when somehow things really turn hard, if they ever do, maybe they won't, but usually life has its hardships. I wouldn't be surprised if she drew on that as some kind of a religious way. You know,
I would almost venture to say that in some cases, instead of looking at the actual causes of things that happen in our lives, maybe it's our own responsibility, maybe it's the responsibility of, you know, the chemical plant down the street that gave me cancer. I think it would be a little easier to say that this is meant to happen to me, you know, and, you know, God does not give me challenges I cannot take. You see what I'm saying?
Okay, thank you very much.